Well, we come to the beginning of Lent, and a story that I love telling every time Lent begins again, and you may have heard it, and in which case I apologize, but welcome to a long-term relationship. And that story comes from, again, my time down when I was in Dobbs Ferry, and the rector of the Episcopal Church in nearby Irvington told this great story. There was a Brad Pitt movie that was being filmed in Irvington, and as usual, Americans become all agog at the idea of a movie being filmed in their midst. And so they approached the Episcopal Church and asked if they could use the parish hall, not for filming, there were going to be some scenes in church, but actually so that the crew could have their meals in the parish hall, vital part of movie production. And so there were many conversations back and forth, and finally came the day when the producer of the movie called the parish office and said, well, we're ready to go ahead and start work on the film. And so the parish secretary said, when would you like to begin? And they said, well, we'd like to begin next week. And she said, oh, I'm terribly sorry. What happens is in Lent, which is where we are now, the parish hall is used quite a bit by the parish for study and for meals during the week. So we'll have to work around that, and I can't guarantee that there'll always be access to the parish hall. And the producer was not very happy, and he said, well, how long does Lent go on for? And the parish secretary said 6 weeks. And he said, whose idea was that? But here we are. And in our thinking about Lent, we get a very interesting visitor today in our scripture reading and in our prayers, in the Great Litany, as well as in our prayers and our readings, and that is Satan. Satan doesn't get too much of a look into the Episcopal Church generally. We kind of pretend that it's there, possibly, metaphor, not sure, best to ignore it. Let's get on with something more pleasant. But it has been a part both of Jewish and Christian tradition for a very long time, and there are significant differences, of course, between the two. Now, I'm going to say this sermon is going to be a bit of Bible study, a little bit of theology, so if you find it too heavy, don't worry, I'll be back to dogs and gardening next week. But anyway, I thought it was very fortuitous when I was in Adams and thinking about what was coming up in terms of preaching this Sunday with so much about Satan and the devil and the tempter, that when I stopped in at Adams to get some more coffee, I found they were carrying a new brand and called Crew. I got a package of it and looked at it, and it's Crew coffee, and it shows souls in torment, and the coffee is called Dark as Hell. The young woman behind the counter cut the top off by mistake so it couldn't be resealed, and in doing so, she put it into a little brown bag as she ground it. And then she said, do you want this package back? And I said, absolutely, I'm going to preach about it. And it becomes tax deductible. So the tempter, Satan, the devil, what do we have to think about and say about him on this, the first Sunday in Lent? Well, going back in study, in the Jewish tradition, the idea of Satan or the devil was not as it became in the Christian tradition. In the Jewish tradition, it wasn't so much a being or a person that was kind of the prince of darkness that had great power, another realm in contrast to God. But instead, the idea of the tempter was exactly that. It was someone sent by God who would tempt or see if people were able to discern right and wrong. So the tempting of Adam and Eve is not so much Satan, as Christians understand it, offering an evil choice for Adam and Eve. But instead, the story is meant to say that Adam and Eve had to grapple with a decision that was put in their way. Now, even more importantly, in terms of the story of Adam and Eve, Satan is not mentioned in that story. We're just told that it was the serpent, but it was the Christian tradition that went back and said, oh, this was Satan. So that's worth noting as well. And what the Jewish tradition gives us is an understanding of the tempter, or as we know him, the devil, that allows us free will and allows us to discern what we are to do, how to do right or wrong. And it isn't so much surrendering to an equal power, because the Jewish tradition was smart enough to say, if God is all-powerful, how can you have a parallel being that has power? Instead, God is supreme, and we are tempted in our lives by, in this case, in the story of Adam and Eve, a tempter or a serpent. There is not the devil with pitchforks and hell that became part of the Christian tradition. So why did Christians, as it's reflected in Matthew's gospel, change that idea of Satan? Well, part of it has to do to the changes that happened philosophically in the time of Judaism leading into Christianity. By the time of the first century of the Common Era, 2,000 years ago, the prevalent thought in the world of Greece and Rome was Platonism. And Platonism maintained you had clear black and white, good and bad. And they were completely separate and discernible. And one had to do with the earth, one had to do with heaven or spirit. Flesh was seen as that which is, by its very nature, inherently sinful, whereas the spirit, the soul, was the greater good and the thing to aspire to. So Christianity, in its thinking, was influenced by this thinking of black and white, good and bad. And in that thinking, Christian writing and interpretation of Jewish texts was that there were these two equal powers that were battling as personifications of good and evil, Satan and God. So in Matthew's gospel, you have Satan being referred to in three ways as this kind of transition period: tempter, devil, and Satan. There's a whole school of thought that believes Satan is actually the proper name that was given to the devil. But in any case, it is clear that the power of Satan in the Christian tradition is much more than just a tempter, but in some way is meant to erode the very foundation of our faith and the power of God. So a great battlefield is set up in Christian understanding that mirrors our own struggles to do what is right and wrong. Perhaps a little bit more cynically, it also worked very well for the church to develop a teaching, a theology of evil and of Satan and of hell, because frankly, it kept people in line. If you said, it's up to you to discern what's right and wrong, and the church will be there to help you in that discernment, that isn't quite as powerful as saying, if you don't do exactly as we say, you're going to end up dark as hell. It worked well for the institution, teaching that way. But in our more modern time, we've come to question that and see where that fits into our understanding of faith and of God. As 21st century Christians, we come out of the past century with some very troubling struggles in our understanding of faith as well as God and of good and evil. Many people say the 20th century was the personification of the struggle between good and evil. That the evil that was done in the 20th century between wars and political struggles was almost unimaginable, and on such a scale that many people stopped believing in God altogether. Also in the 20th century was the rise of a belief that evil was not necessarily personified and motivated or energized by a person, but instead arose from things like mental illness. People who did terrible, evil things were mentally ill. And that may certainly be true, but it begs the question about our own ability to discern what's right and wrong, and if there isn't a standard that is not just merely explained away when it falls short. Well, Episcopalians haven't helped the situation any because we have mention of the devil and Satan in various places. We had it just now in the Great Litany when we talk about trampling the devil under our feet. Also in our baptismal liturgy, we say the following words. As part of our promises, we say right at the beginning, do you renounce Satan and all the spiritual forces of wickedness that rebel against God? And we hopefully say we renounce them. And do you renounce the evil powers of this world which corrupt and destroy the creatures of God? And then we renounce them. The problem of those promises is they infer an external existence of evil. That somehow the devil comes into us not just to tempt us, but to somehow drastically mislead us and cause us to do evil. Now, far be it from me to question anything that is in the Book of Common Prayer, but I do struggle with the idea that we do evil because the devil comes into us and makes us do it. In my experience, it's much more common for me to be making bad decisions or decisions that hurt other people based on my own lack of awareness, my own vulnerabilities, my own motives. I don't feel that when I do something that is wrong, the devil has come into me to do it. I take responsibility, or try to, for my actions, my beliefs, my discernment of good and ill. Now, if we don't believe in an external existence of evil or a devil that makes us do things against our better judgment, then how do we talk about good and evil in the Episcopal Church? Well, first of all, and it's important to say, we believe in conscious versus unconscious. We believe that sometimes we're unconscious of evil consequences of our actions. And we're asked and bidden to be discerning in all respects, to weigh and to examine, to discuss, and to come to some understanding, which may be flawed, may be mistaken, but the process of discernment is key in trying to understand and make decisions about good and evil. Now, we can do that congregationally and individually. We can do that through conversations that you and I have, or conversations between people that you love and respect when you're facing a moral decision. And interestingly, the church, especially the Episcopal Church, is called upon to make moral decisions from time to time. One of the ones I've been very conscious of has been a decision by our diocese and other dioceses in the Episcopal Church regarding the armaments industry and our investments as an institution. As you know, I'm a trustee of the diocese, and what we're charged with as trustees is to be custodians of the resources of the diocese, which include the investments and the portfolio of our endowment as a diocese. It's not gigantic, it's around $65 million. But that's part of our job, is to oversee that. And so a proposition came up, a resolution came up at convention 2 years ago that called for the Diocese of New York, and the trustees particularly, to divest from the arms industry, from funds that were invested in companies that relied upon the arms industry to make money. This was a very controversial subject, and a number of trustees resigned over the resolution. It ended up passing after being debated on the floor of convention, and then the implementing of it came up, which has been very complicated. I won't bore you with the details about investments, but as trustees, we are charged to do the best we can in our supervision of our investments. And the question for the trustees is, were we compromising that primary job as trustees by reinvesting our money in funds that were separated from the arms industry? There were all sorts of other controversies around it, complexities. It's actually fairly hard to separate money into clean and unclean money. And making a black and white distinction about which is which was not as easy as it seemed on paper. It also, interestingly enough, was harder to get representation in overseeing our endowment because it was going to be confined and limited, and therefore was going to be more expensive in order to maintain. These were all issues around the core issue, which remained a part of what had been passed by convention. And I sometimes think that we are unaware as a congregation as to what is being talked about in the wider church, and perhaps that's something that we would like doing more here at St. Peter's. Not because there is a stance that is Episcopalian, but because it challenges us to think about what we feel, and there's no right or wrong. Even the fact that a resolution is passed by convention doesn't make it absolutely right, as we've seen in trying to live out the fulfillment of that resolution. But it raises questions for us that are important. And perhaps we'll have a venue where we can do that as a parish from time to time. Because the Episcopal Church is lucky in that we're not bound by authoritarian rule. So we as Episcopalians can make up our own minds. We can discern what we believe is right and wrong, what's true, what's good, and what's evil. And it's not always easy. So I am intrigued by a return to the Jewish tradition of understanding this guy, tempter, Satan, or devil. That the power of that embodied person is not to challenge or threaten us with eternal damnation, but instead to challenge us to understand our own free will, our agency as people of faith, and how we come to understand good and evil in our lives that we live out together. So for me, absolutely, this Lent will be about certain disciplines, about trying to keep away from temptations, whatever they might be. But it is helpful to me to think about permission to question and to ask questions, to discern together as the people of God here in this place what's right and wrong, what we're called to do as the people of God, and where God would have us go. Amen.